Welcome to Classroom Strategies for Student Behaviors, More Than Just Managing. I'm Victoria White from All Belong Center for Inclusive Education. Let me tell you a little bit about All Belong. We equip congregations and schools to glorify God through purposeful, innovative inclusion of persons with varied abilities. And we want this to be meaningful in your schools too. Now, you might have come to this session because you find yourself in an interesting place. We often find ourselves in interesting places when we're discussing student behaviors. Go ahead and pause for a moment and think about exactly what it is that brought you to this session today. As we come in, I want to give us a place to begin. I think an important place to begin when we talk about student behaviors is what we call God's puzzle pieces. At All Belong, we have a lot of these pink and green puzzle pieces around because we use them so often as a visual to remind us of who we are and how we come together as a community like pieces of a puzzle. What's important to remember is that student behaviors are often telling us about things that they may be good at and they enjoy doing. We might call those their green areas. And quite often a lot about their pink areas, the things that students might struggle with. And so often we see a student who is mostly pink, or so we think by what we're seeing, right? So it's important to remember that students do come with struggles and challenges, but everyone also comes with the other side of the piece, strengths and those gifts that we need in order to have a complete community together. So I think that's an important place to begin before we start talking about what behaviors we might be working with and how to work with them. So I encourage you to pause for a minute or two right now and think about what relevance might puzzle pieces have in your classroom. As we move on, a couple of things I want to note. First of all behavior is communication. This is important because we can think about how communication comes out in many different forms. An infant screaming is communicating a lot without any use of words and certainly gets some pretty quick responses. How about a couple sitting quite apart from one another? They're communicating a lot about their relationship at the moment. Or some people snuggling up in a friendly embrace. They're communicating a lot about their relationship as well. Things very different from the other couple. Now, some things that we have come to learn from experts like Dr. Ross Greene are about how students are communicating through their behavior. Dr. Ross Greene says that kids do well when they can, meaning that by communicating in their behaviors, that they are communicating in their behaviors that there is something that you are asking them to do that they cannot yet do. They lack the skills to do these things. I encourage you to do some learning from Dr. Ross Greene through his website, or some books like Lost at School or The Explosive Child. And maybe it was a child who could be described as explosive that brought your interest to this session today. So I encourage you to do some extra learning from Dr. Ross Greene about the idea that not only is behavior communication, but that students do well if they can, and in exhibiting certain behaviors, they're letting you know that they lack the skills to do what you're expecting them to do. Number two, please take note that you are now a behavior detective. So get out your magnifying glass and start investigating what it is that those behaviors are communicating and what it is that you can work with the student to do about these things. So with that in mind, let's get started on some classroom strategies for you. The first thing you're going to want to do is begin by getting to know the student, right? You have to get to know that puzzle piece and what's pink and what's green for that individual in order for any of these strategies to work. A great place to start with that is another resource, Nuts and Bolts of Inclusive Education, that I encourage you to have a look at. There are a lot of great forms in there and walks you through the process of how do you get to know students most excellently so that you can serve them well. That will help a lot. And really just thinking about who is this student, right? So that you can teach each student and not just react. Because the truth is, in your classroom, you are not only teaching content, you're teaching kids, and you're teaching these social and emotional skills that they may need. So when they react with tears or an inappropriate behavior, you can identify that with them and say, I can see that this is how you are reacting to this. What can we do about it, right? Helping them to learn about the emotions and the reactions that they are experiencing. Let me give you a couple of examples of how you can teach instead of react. For example, a student is bursting out going, "Wah!" when he's really not supposed to, and the volume is just too loud. Can you use a remote control to turn down the volume on his voice until the level of his voice matches yours? What about students running down the hallway when they should be lining up nicely? What does it look like to line up nicely? Can you say, let's go back and practice that again? Here's what it looks like to line up in the way I want you to. Now let's try it, right? A teaching opportunity. Or, oh goodness, those pencils are spilled all over the room. We need them to be cleaned up on the shelf. What does it look like for them to be cleaned up on the shelf? Does that child have the same concept of what that means as you do? Do you have a picture on the shelf of what it looks like when the pencils are all cleaned up and put away? Taking a picture and adding that to the shelf can be a really helpful way to just show students and to teach them what that desired behavior is. Maybe it's carpet time and kids are sprawling all over the place instead of sitting nicely on their letter. What does it look like to sit nicely on the letter? Can you practice that again? Or again, sort of bursting out in surprise at something versus raising their hand, right? Again, opportunities to practice the appropriate behavior so that you're teaching them those behaviors as opposed to reacting to them in a negative way. Something that helps you do this is noticing things about the individual, right? Noticing those behaviors that they have. So not just that God gave them a beautiful smile, but that they use their smile to greet their friends. They use their bodies in ways that honor others, right? I love how you're so kind to hold the door for other people. Noticing those things the individual does that are positive, that you would like to encourage more of in them and in others, right? But noticing specific things about the individual that they also have control over. Now, this is all part of developing a relationship with students, a key component. Get down on their level, play with their blocks, right? Do you have paraprofessionals or classroom aides who this might be some of their primary goal in being a part of the class is to get to know the kids and develop a relationship with them, because that is what is going to help in those behavior techniques later on, is just having that relationship with students and sharing a level with them. Now, something else you're really going to want to know is what calms this child. You have a child who is exploding in anger or frustration or in a behavior that you are struggling with, how to manage that in your classroom. What is it that calms that child? Some kids might really need a good squeeze between two heavy beanbags, or sometimes sitting in a quiet corner, not out of punishment, but because that is what helps them to calm down. That's what gives their body and their minds what they need in order to begin to regulate their own behaviors again. So learning what it is that calms the child is a very valuable piece of your detective work. Now, if we can think about some behavior strategies like we might think about a football game, I want you to be able to play the field well, right? If we're playing in the behavior management playing field, let's play the field well. A great part of that is to know that offense is the best defense. You don't want to be on defense very often, reacting to behaviors that are already out of control as you see it in your classroom, right? You want to have things planned ahead and prepared and be able to be guiding students through the day and through the activities and through their behaviors. That means you are on offense. Let's look at some strategies that keep you on the offense. First of all, you want to look at your own principles. If you look at your handout today, there is a page all about the principles that we take from Love and Logic. And these start with things like belief in the value of all people, that self-care is not selfish, right? Things like choices are what lead to responsibilities, sharing power and control with children, and responsibility to the children, not responsibility for the children. Are these the kind of principles that are guiding how you manage behaviors in your classroom? Now, another technique or another method coming through is called restorative practices. And we've been doing a lot of learning about this as a staff at All Belong. This is a great way that your entire school, your administrative staff may want to get on board with the methods of restorative practices. If you're only going to practice this in your classroom, you'll want to think about some of those principles. So I want to show you something called the social discipline window of restorative practices. And again, much like Love and Logic, it's working with students, cooperation and collaboration, rather than doing things to children or for children, or just avoiding things altogether. So think about these concepts and think about how they are framing how you approach the behaviors that are coming in your classroom. Go ahead and pause for a minute or two to think about this and wonder, what principles frame your classroom management techniques? Moving into a few other ideas, you'll want to get informed. So that's number 2 on the list, is be informed. Are you informed about some sensory differences that may be occurring in your classroom? We think about being tactile and learning in multisensory modes, so we use sight and hearing and touch. Are we also using smell and taste and balance? And do we have body awareness that may be lacking or oversensitive in some students? So we want to think about some sensory differences that we might be noticing in children as well. It could be that these behaviors are signaling that this student is overwhelmed because of too much stimulation, too many things to look at, too many loud sounds or sounds that are just too loud. It could be that touch is interpreted as pain whenever there's even a slight brush against them, right? Or maybe that body awareness issue, something called proprioception. They just don't have much of it. And so the touching and the leaning and the sprawling in general is just a lack of body awareness. And so the student is just showing you that they need some more skills or at least some more supports in these areas. So thinking about sensory differences. Now, as we think about this, you might think about most of us operate at about middle C, if we can use a piano as a reference point for this, right? We're able to sort of tune out things that aren't important so that we can tune into the things that are important. So if you're in a school environment and need to sort of tune out all of the bodies who are close to you lined up on the stage or are also shaking around some pom-poms in a big assembly or something like that, you'll need to sort of narrow your system to that middle C to know what to pay attention to and what to let go of. And for some of us, that's a little harder. We already operate a little outside of that middle C. Those sounds or those sights or those feelings, those touch feelings, are interpreted differently. Maybe we are oversensitive to touch or we are undersensitive to sound. We don't operate in that middle zone so well. And this can be varied in our different sensory systems. So just because you're oversensitive to sounds doesn't mean that you'll be oversensitive to touch as well. It may be the opposite. Each of the sensory systems operates independently, and so you might be above middle C in one area and below middle C in another. So these are some things to consider as you're thinking about how your classroom might be an overwhelming environment or might be understimulating in some ways. Some of us might struggle to be in a large crowd, and this environment might seem to be too crowded for us. Some of us might feel like we're behind a screen and everything takes a lot of effort in order to feel it or to interact with it well. Maybe that's from sound, right? Maybe it's an issue of low hearing or low vision or low tactile awareness, right? So thinking about, again, detective work. What is it this student might be showing you through their behaviors? And can you give some acceptable alternatives? A great resource to think about this is called The Out of Sync Child, a great book by Carol Stock Kranowitz. I highly suggest a copy of that on your shelves as a school. But again, offering some things that might be a good alternative for students. So for example, you have a student who has an overactive area of touch and taste, and they're constantly putting things in their mouth that you don't want them to put in their mouth. Can you give some stir sticks from the coffee station? Kids can chew on these all day long without making too much of a mess, and they can be thrown away, and they're pretty cheap. Do you have things like a fidget pencil, something that they can actively engage with their hands while they're also using a tool that you already have in your classroom, or some other form of fidget, right? Something that can occupy those hands that need something to touch. Sometimes sitting on an exercise ball or a wiggle cushion is a great technique to, again, give the body what it needs. or even a stuffed animal that is the stuffing has been taken out of and now it has weighted beads or some rice in it, so it's nice and heavy. Just something heavy to support the need for some touch that student might have, so that they're not craving it from other people or other places that are more disruptive to the classroom. So providing alternatives, that behavior is seeking something, and can you provide an alternative that works better in the classroom setting? Another part about being informed is the idea of trauma experiences with children. So we've also been doing a lot of learning about this in All Belong, and I encourage you to look into some more of the resources at allbelong.org and talking to our teacher consultants and school psychologists. So the neurodevelopmental issues that come along with trauma are a big issue that you might want to think about in your behavior management strategies. You need to be informed about what trauma can do in a learning scenario. We talk a lot about students who have flipped their lid, so to speak, that we need everything put together, that their brain needs to be engaged in the thinking brain. And if there is trauma going on, that lid is flipped and they are not in a thinking position. So learning and behavior modification is going to be very difficult for a student because they simply don't have the skills to do that at the time. They're in survival mode right now. So again, thinking about how can you be informed? That's a proactive, offensive way to think about behavior management in your classroom. Some great books for that would be Help for Billy, and I just want to encourage you to look into some more resources about being trauma informed. Number 3, how about being prepared yourself? Even just having those lesson plans thought through, and make sure that you are preparing yourself and the plans, but also adding in some adaptations. So you have one way that you think of the activities being done. Are there some adaptive ways that those activities could be done for a student who needs it done a little more quietly, or in that space in the corner by themselves for a little while, or with more tactile involvement, right? So how can you add in different adaptations to your plans so that you don't walk into a classroom unprepared and have students, right, all sort of running the classroom in whatever way they think best at the moment. So what else can you do to be prepared? Think about some resources for the learning that you might need to do. Do you need to learn more about things like autism spectrum disorder or ADHD or anxiety or those issues with trauma? Encourage you to look into some resources like Kids in the Syndrome Mix, a great book full of all sorts of areas that children might struggle. ASD to Z has some great resources, as well as other trainings in the area of autism spectrum disorder. And another book by Dr. Scott Danforth, Becoming a Great Inclusive Educator, so full of great insights to help you be prepared and to think about those adaptations for reaching every child, so that your classroom turns into a place of meaningful learning for every child. So, pause to wonder for a minute or two, what might you want to learn more about? As we continue to talk about that number 3, being prepared, I want to think about preparing the environment of your classroom, right? So how things are arranged, the space that you are in. Think about those reading nooks or table times or one-on-one centers, right? So have you thought through, again, if you want to have adaptations to the lessons that you're planning, do you have spaces set up for all of those things? Do you have seating arrangements and sort of wall partitions and things like that put into place, so that as children are engaging in your classroom, their behaviors are also much more easily set to the tone of what the room arrangement is. Some of this can be in just the seating that you provide. So do you have exercise balls to sit on for those kids who have some wiggles to get out? Do you have a beanbag to sit in as a calming space? Do you have some balance stools? Do you have something like this carpet circle called a parking spot? I like these a lot better than a carpet square, because when a child sits on this, it's big enough that they can still see the circle around them even as they sit on it. So often a carpet square sort of disappears when the child sits on it and they can't see that boundary around them anymore. What about even just having chairs that have a back but also have arms to sit in front of a table, and now a child is sort of boxed in, and sometimes that is extremely helpful to identify where their body needs to be in space. So putting some boundaries or utilizing different kinds of seating can even be a tool for setting up for success. Being prepared can also mean preparing the kids themselves for success. Do they know what to expect? Do they know what's expected of them? Can you prepare them a little bit? Do you have a meet and greet time in which you get to greet them by name, shake their hand, or do a fist bump, or whatever is appropriate now from our social distance and behind our masks and in virtual relationships, right? How are we doing this to just greet each student so that we, again, are building that relationship right from the start and identifying that this is an individual you're interacting with before it's a behavior issue in the classroom, right? And think about what's meaningful for this child, what is safe for both of you, and again, right? If this is a child who's very huggy and loves that tactile sensation and hugs are all right, go for it. Give hugs to that child right off the bat. If that's something that is going to be hurtful or upsetting to a child, then want to think about that, knowing that about the child. How you greet them, right, is honoring who they are and what their needs are as well. Assigning a job right off the bat can be a great thing to do as well. And I know a lot of great classroom teachers have classroom jobs assigned right along with calendar time. Some students do really well having something to scrub here and there, or books to have to reshelve, or to be a tutor to a friend in the classroom, right? So having some purpose can also redirect some of the energy that can be coming out in different behaviors. But key to all of these things is giving information. Love something called the school welcome story. It's a social story about coming to your classroom, to your school. So it might go something like this. My name's Evelyn, and I want to tell you about my school. So we have a picture of Evelyn and a little sentence about her. Next, we have a picture of her school and her sentence that says, here is my school. It's called O'Donnell Elementary School, right? So giving examples, giving pictures, showing that this is this child's story. And this is a calendar, she says. It shows what day I get to start school. I might have times to visit my school before I start, but this will be my first day of school. So again, just setting the tone of all of the things that she's going to engage in. And you could do this for every single child. You could write it a little more generically or send it home with parents to fill in the page about the individual child. And this might be a fun way to get to know your students before the start of the school year as well. You can adapt this social story for 6th grade overnight camp and what to expect there, or the Christmas program that you're getting ready for, or the field trip to the pumpkin patch. How about maybe that lunchtime routine, or getting hot lunch, or some different social interaction times where things might be a little more challenging to navigate, and those are where you're seeing some behaviors coming out, right? Or what's a great topic to discuss at high school break for those students who kind of struggle to come up with ways to interact with their peers, right? So many different ways you can utilize these social stories. How do we go through the Stations of the Cross? What does it look like to be a part of the Eucharist and to receive communion, right? So many different opportunities for ways that you can teach through these social stories and making it personal. This is my story, right? With pictures of the child doing these things and the places and the people they will interact with as they do them. Something else you want to think about is providing structure. Did you know you can provide structure to the time? Visual structure through a visual schedule, having a list on the wall of what's going to happen one time and then the next thing. You can also have timers that will literally show how time disappears. These things called time timers are one of my favorite tools. Love them in every classroom I've been in because you can actually watch the time disappear. And there is a button on the back if you want to turn on a beeper that will go off at the end of the time, or turn it off so that there is no sound, because again, right, some kids might be very sensitive to sounds. But watching the time disappear takes that concept of time, of what's going to happen first, what's going to happen next, how long, half an hour, those sorts of things that can be really hard to grasp onto. And maybe a student is letting you know that they don't understand time and they don't have a framework for how to operate within the time that you're saying is happening. Show them, right? And also you can make the timer the bad guy sometimes. I'm sorry, it's time to be done with that activity. The time is all gone, right? Another way to provide structure is to put structure on the page. This fun stuff called EZC highlighter tape can highlight some words on a page so that that is what the students get to focus on. Even works on Bible pages without tearing those super thin pages. It comes off cleanly. but it can be so helpful to direct kids to what it is that they need to look at. Or even maybe you need to give a little highlighting around the portion of the page that you want them to focus on coloring and not outside of that. Sometimes they need just that extra visual reminder or that extra structure to know how to navigate the page that you're giving them. So these are all different ways of providing structure. Let's think back to some of those principles about our environments and how we're managing behaviors. I want to talk about something called enforceable statements and the way that we're using our language with kids. So are we force feeding them, so to speak, like that mom who just wants to get that kid to eat these beans because they're good for them, so just put it in your mouth and swallow it? Or are we saying those who eat their beans will also get to have dessert? Now that's something we can actually enforce, right? As they say, you can give a child the vegetables, but you can't force them to eat them. Can we put things in front of kids in a way that's enforceable? So think about some statements and how you might use them differently in your classroom. Look at your handout for examples of what some enforceable statements are, and think for a moment. So pause for a minute or two. How can you use enforceable statements? There's room on your handout for you to write one of your own. A few final strategies. Think along with the students. We've talked a few times about how to come with students into this process rather than doing things to them or for them or other areas, right? So find your Pooh Bear thinking spot and do some thinking along with the students. A couple of techniques for that. One of them known as Mind the Gap, from the London Underground message that would come on the tram that would say, mind the gap before you enter the train, right? Well, a teacher happened to hear this when he was in London and took it back to his classroom and created this format called Mind the Gap. If you look at your handout, you will see a diagram for this so you can create it yourself as well. On the bottom is a box for what you're going to do or what you're doing now, and then the box that says mind the gap, and that's where you stop and think before you move into the next choice, right? Because each behavior is really a choice, and that's what we're helping kids to see here. So there's the activity we're doing, we're stopping to mind the gap, and then we have choices. These choices lead two ways. This choice will lead up to this consequence. This choice will lead up to this consequence. And quite often it's a positive choice to a positive consequence, a negative choice to a negative consequence, right? But these are just the things that will happen if you make these choices. If you're going to do this behavior, you'll get to stay in class and join us for snack time. If you're going to do this behavior, you're going to have to go out of the classroom until you can make the choice to join us, right? Another technique like this that simplifies it just a little bit is just called boxes. So you have behavior and consequence. Maybe color-coded in green because this is a positive behavior leading to a positive consequence, negative behavior that leads to a negative consequence. Just diagramming out with the kids so that they realize they have a choice in the consequences that are coming from the behaviors that they are choosing to enact in. Finally, have green time, right? Go back to that puzzle piece idea. If you have students who are struggling in so many of the things that you're asking them to do you have opportunity for them to do some things they are good at and that they enjoy doing? Have some green time planned in for these children. So helpful in that proactive stance. Let them enjoy what they are doing. And finally, pray. Let's engage with children using the model of Jesus to ask for God's intervention in this scenario and also to bless the child. So it's both modeling and engaging the child in a meaningful interaction where we introduce our Savior into the conversation as well. I hope these ideas are helpful to you as you engage in doing more than just managing student behaviors.